In the last episode, we did a deep dive into Cambodian banks in the 1990s. Far too many were little more than money laundering ventures. That matters because Haing Ngor owned a banking license. When his attempt to sell that license to a business partner fell apart, that individual, whom we call Larry, threatened Ngor's life. That's according to the interview that Ngor's secretary and girlfriend gave to the LAPD. She also mentioned something else, a quote, Singapore group. These were investors that Larry represented in Cambodia. So who are they? Were they legit investors? If they weren't, then why would people from wealthy Singapore want a brand new bank in Cambodia, of all places, except to launder money? This episode gets into the weeds of our investigatory process. It's complicated, so I'm going to put an explainer on the Who Killed Haing Ngor webpage and on my Substack. My name is Patricia Nunan, and this is Who Killed Haing Ngor. I need you to imagine a Venn diagram. I've actually drawn this multiple times for people I've interviewed. There's a small circle labeled Haing Ngor. It overlaps slightly with a second circle that's a smidge larger. That one is labeled Larry. That overlap represents the bank license deal between the two of them. Then there's a third circle. It overlaps slightly with Larry's circle, but it's enormous. That circle is called Harry, with an H. Harry is connected to more than 1,300 companies registered in Singapore since the late 1980s. So who's Harry? And what's his relationship to our suspect, Larry? I'll tell you right off the bat that Frank and I found patterns that raise major red flags for money laundering within those 1,300 company registrations. This episode is about our deep dive into the Singapore group that Ngor's secretary told the LAPD about. She said Larry was their representative in Cambodia. So who else is in the Singapore group, and how nefarious was it? A quick recap. Ngor sold his bank license to Larry for $20,000 in 1995. But that license became worthless when Ngor missed the deadline to change the name on it. Larry threatened Ngor's life and he went into hiding. He came out once he was able to pay Larry back half that sum, leaving Ngor $10,000 in debt. But this is what Frank and I have been asking ourselves. Is $10,000 really enough to kill someone, especially a Hollywood actor? Or was Larry actually angry about losing the chance to have a bank in Cambodia for money laundering purposes? As we established in the last episode, there were criminal groups that owned or controlled their own banks in Southeast Asia in the 1990s. Money laundering profits could reach into the millions. That could be a motive for killing Haing Ngor. So we need to look at who Larry is connected to in Singapore. But first, a bit more about the country itself. Singapore is a global financial hub, the quote, Switzerland of Southeast Asia. It's a city-state renowned for commodities trading, offshore banking, foreign exchange markets, private wealth management, and a great deal of discretion. Singapore's always been about money. It's one of the world's busiest ports. A huge number of ships go through there. So historically, it's always been a place where money changes hands.
Singapore's historic role in Southeast Asia has been to facilitate these money flows.
This is PJ Thum. He's a Singaporean historian and founder of the news site New Narrative. He's also a democracy activist living in exile in the Philippines.
If you think of Singapore, right, we're known to be very rich, prosperous, but where does that money come from? We have no natural resources. Our main resource is the fact that we are the preeminent port on the Malacca Straits, through which 50% of the world's trade passes. That's how we became rich, by being in the right place. But when you get past that, what on earth do we do? How do we make money? So Singapore is a major offshore financial center, money laundering center. Bloomberg invented the term Singapore washing.
Singapore washing refers to the way some financial players will register a company in Singapore to distance it from the prying eyes of national and international regulators. It's associated with dodgy Chinese companies or illicit networks. They set up firms in Singapore just to look clean. The term was made popular by Bloomberg News. And that makes perfect sense. Singapore has a strong reputation for transparency. It came in third on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index in 2025. That's just behind Denmark and Finland. Singaporeans are also renowned for their law-abiding nature. Everything from jaywalking, littering, and famously to selling chewing gum is outlawed. Drug traffickers face the death penalty, and it's routinely carried out. Most Singaporeans go along with this somewhat draconian system as a trade-off for wealth and political stability. A friend of mine who used to work there calls Singapore a happy North Korea. That transparency has been useful for Frank and me trying to figure out who killed Haing Ngor. I mean, how do we know that Harry is linked to 1,300 companies? How did we find these patterns? It's because Singapore's business registry, called ACRA, is online and open. Anyone can log in. The thing is, some of those laws I mentioned may just be for us small fish. For bigger fish, Singapore is willing to hide an awful lot of secrets and vast amounts of money. I reached out several times to Singapore's Criminal Investigation Department, the CID, for an interview about money laundering risks. I've never heard back. But the government consistently says it has zero tolerance for illicit financial flows. I've also reached out to at least a dozen academics, NGO staff, and political risk analysts for interviews. Virtually no one will talk on the record about Singapore, plus money laundering and organized crime. If Singaporean authorities were to hear my podcast or see a reference to it, that could only mean trouble for my interviewees. Just 2 people spoke to me off the record. PJ Thumb is the only one directly connected to Singapore, brave enough to give me a recorded interview. It took me more than a year to find him. He's about to mention the PAP. That's Singapore's ruling party, the People's Action Party.
We are happy to enable a lot of criminality in the rest of the world, and especially in our backyard, as long as that criminality doesn't affect Singapore society. So that's one reason why the PAP is so famously strict to police its own island so that the criminality that it is benefiting of elsewhere doesn't enter and become a problem for it. But it's happy to take the money of, the Burmese generals, of the Indonesian tycoons, especially under Suharto, right? All this stolen money, the Marcos money parked in Singapore. It's happy to facilitate the exploitation of the rest of Southeast Asia, the destruction of Southeast Asian environments. That's how Singapore makes its money. Because what else does Singapore have? Nothing, right? So for there to be Singapore businessmen connected with all this organized crime, that is very normal and typical. And Singaporean businessmen have been implicated in corruption and bribery scandals all around the world.
That is the most honest thing I've ever heard a Singaporean say about Singapore.
Where do you think I'm in exile? Why do you think my government kicked me out?
The others I spoke to echoed to me what Thumb said. Singaporean authorities will look the other way about money laundering and illicit financial flows up until the point the criminality starts to mess with Singapore's international reputation. The last major money laundering bust in Singapore was in 2023. It reached $2.2 billion before authorities took action. These funds were connected to illicit gambling and scam networks linked largely to Chinese nationals. Some held multiple passports, including from Cambodia. 9 international banks and financial institutions were penalized for links to that money laundering ring. So when you think about Singapore, think of it as a living, breathing paradox. It's an overwhelmingly stable, law-abiding place. It has a strong economy and high standards of living. The overwhelming majority of trade done there is entirely legal. But its reputation for being lawful and transparent is exactly what attracts financial criminals to it. Back to that Venn diagram. Remember, there's a small Haing Ngor circle that overlaps slightly with the Larry circle. That one overlaps with Harry's circle, which is huge. Our suspect Larry is a naturalized Singaporean citizen who was born in China. He's got a handful of companies registered in Singapore. They're no longer active. A quick side note here. In 1998, 2 years after Ngor was killed, Larry declared bankruptcy. It's in the ACRA records. I'm not sure what to make of this just yet, but I'll probably circle back to that in later episodes. Harry's name, meanwhile, is listed within the registrations of more than 1,300 companies. Not all remain active, but we're focusing on what he had going on in Ngor's time frame, the 1990s. One business stands out, and shout out to Frank, he's the one who caught this. It's a central bank. It was active in the same window of time that Ngor had his banking license. Is it possible that Harry is part of the Singapore group? Maybe. Maybe he's a legit businessman. But you have to ask, why would people from somewhere as rich as Singapore want a brand new bank in Cambodia, Southeast Asia's Wild West, in the midst of a money laundering boom? To try to get a handle on this, I went straight to the top.
I would say this individual is a nominee, that he's in the corporate services business. That'd be my guess. Without any additional information, just looking at this and the number of companies, to me, and the positions that he holds within those companies, It looks like I call them corporate service providers.
Gregory Coleman is a retired FBI special agent. His focus is financial crimes. He's actually the agent who in 1998 busted the Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort. He was a criminal stockbroker played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie by that name. Coleman was played by Kyle Chandler. We met in a New York City coffee shop.
There's tons of these offshore. You can find them in a million places. Cayman, Singapore. They incorporate companies for other people. They act as nominee directors, nominee shareholders. They complete all the minutes. They keep the companies current. But other than from a paperwork standpoint, they really don't do anything with the companies. They sell the companies off. They're basically, from my experience, they're lackeys for other people, if I may use that word.
Basically, Harry is a registrar. You pay him a fee to do all the paperwork to set up your company. He's then listed as a director, a shareholder, or a secretary of that company. And that's it. That's a possibility Frank and I had discussed, that Harry is a CSP, but that's just part of what's going on. A quick note on our methodology. The criteria Frank and I used to examine Harry's registered companies are the red flags listed by FATF. That's the Financial Action Task Force. It's an international body that sets global standards to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. And there are tons of red flags. Hundreds of Harry's companies are registered at the same handful of addresses, which are low-rent shopping malls in Singapore. Red flag. Many were open and closed within a few short months. Red flag. Harry's listed as the director of an auditing firm that audits companies in which Harry is listed as a shareholder or a director. He's potentially auditing himself. Red flag. The ACRA registry requires that every company rank its business activities as primary, secondary, and tertiary. These are the reasons why you want to set up a company in the first place. Hundreds of companies linked to Harry are financial services, insurance, or holding companies. Red flag. Some companies have business activities that are mismatched. For instance, a construction company listing its second or third purpose as a financial holding company. Red flag. Hundreds had business descriptions that are vague to the point of meaninglessness, like wholesale trade of a variety of goods without a dominant product. That can mean anything. Red flag. Frank and I also spoke to Deborah LaPrevotte. She's a retired FBI agent. Specifically, she was a supervisory special agent who helped set up the FBI's anti-kleptocracy program. She's currently the senior investigator with an anti-corruption group called Restitution Impact. LaPrevotte agrees with Coleman that Harry is just a registrar, a corporate services provider. But some of the red flags stood out to her, too.
It's interesting where you said, this one company has like three purposes, right? Wholesale, and then
wholesale trade without a dominant product, and then, financial insurance activities or a holding company. It's frequently money listed secondary or tertiary in some of these registrations.
I mean, that's interesting, but again, it's not criminal until you see that they're using that to move money illicitly. For that, I need bank records.
So we've run into a wall. Despite the red flags, we need financial records to determine if a company is breaking the law. The ACRA registry just isn't enough. But what about that bank? Harry is the secretary to a central bank. Its ACRA classification is different from all the others. And once again, this is in the same window of time that Haing Ngor had a bank license in Cambodia, and Larry was the representative there of the Singapore group.
Banks, any place I've ever looked, come with a higher level of regulation, a higher level of scrutiny. If, in fact, it's a company that's in the banking or brokerage industry, then that would, of course, rise to the top of the list. That's something more important to look into because it gives you access to the financial systems, right? The other companies by themselves don't give you access to a financial system. A bank does. Right. So if it actually is a bank, then yes, I think it's important to dig behind that one and see what's behind it.
I'm just looking at the data right now on my other screen here, and it was opened or registered in 1993, and it remained registered until 2007, but it does share the same address as a bunch of other companies.
I mean, that's very interesting. Was it ever used for a purpose? So all they've done is they've got a piece of paper that says they have a company in the name of that bank. That's all that's telling you. Unless we go to Dun & Bradstreet or other things and say, do they have employees? Now that they have a company, did they open a bank account or did they open a bank? Is there a bank anywhere in Singapore or elsewhere by the name of that bank?
I've not been able to find any evidence that Harry's bank ever opened in Singapore, Cambodia, or anywhere else. There are two financial companies at the same address with very similar names. This is not actually what it's called, but for example, instead of State Bank, the other two firms are Gate and Mate. Again, that's not illegal, but red flag. The bottom line is that in some ways, LaPrevotte and Coleman agree with Frank and me. These patterns raise questions. The bank raises questions. But we need another deeper layer of paperwork with the actual transaction histories carried out by the bank or Harry's other registered companies to determine if there's any criminal wrongdoing. As FBI agents, Coleman or LaPrevotte would have access to that deeper layer much more easily if they were assigned to look into Harry. They could submit requests for cooperation from the Singaporean authorities. For me as a journalist and Frank as a researcher for the Innocence Center, we just don't have that kind of pull. So that's pretty much where we're at with the Singaporean money laundering angle for now. The original title I had for this episode was actually Cul-de-sac. I spent hours building Excel spreadsheets. Frank told me he logged more than 100 hours. Again, this has all been about trying to establish a motive for killing Haing Ngor. Ngor had sold the bank license to Larry for $20,000. Larry threatened his life, and Ngor went into hiding until he was able to pay back half. Frank and I just don't see 10 grand as enough to justify killing Ngor. But the lost opportunity cost to a criminal syndicate for the profits that could be made by money laundering through their very own bank in lawless Cambodia, that could reach into the millions. But we cannot connect Harry to any crime. By extension, we haven't found any evidence against Larry. I don't think Harry has any connection to the Singapore group, and I don't think he has any connection whatsoever to Haing Ngor. I'm still a little surprised, though. If Frank and I could find out so many red flags associated with the companies registered by just one individual, then what could Singaporean authorities find if they actually looked? I've checked out Harry's home address on Google Maps. The guy is rich. Singapore's an island with a limited amount of space, and he has an extremely nice home. There's a Singapore-based analyst I shared a lot of this information with, one who spoke to me off the record. She says that if Harry is involved in crime, it's possible he's flying under the radar with profits too low for Singaporean authorities to take action. International bodies like FATF, the U.S. Treasury Department, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, they generate reports that highlight the same paradox that I have. Singapore sits at the center of Asia's financial ecosystem. Like Switzerland, it has a strong tradition of financial secrecy. Therefore, it's going to attract criminal networks. And it's only gotten worse since Ngor's day.
Singapore is taking over for Hong Kong now in my opinion, they're trying to become the key financial center in Asia now, right? People are fleeing Hong Kong because it's basically China, and China can just come in and take your companies whenever they want, and they do, right? And if you piss off the regime, as they say, you're out of business, right? So, Singapore is booming. Singapore, it's clean, it's safe. It's basically a benevolent dictatorship. And this has been going on for years now. Even before I retired in 2015 from the FBI, I saw Singapore growing. And I started seeing more and more money coming through not necessarily shell companies, but banks in Singapore. And that goes back to 2013, 14.
So the volume increased, but did you see dubious?
Yeah, if I'm following it, it's dubious. I don't follow clean money. I only follow dirty money.
As I said, my original title for this episode was Cul-de-sac. I was going to make it just a bonus episode for the hardiest of listeners, because despite the hours that Frank and I logged, we just didn't advance the investigation. I worry about overloading my audience, so thank you for hanging in. Then again, this is a real-time investigation. I'm trying to share enough information to elicit more input from listeners without undermining the investigation as a whole. So the narrative zigzags. It zigzags through the dimensions of Ngor's life that the LAPD ignored. Ngor's secretary told police there was a Singapore group. To me, that's not the kind of thing anyone would dream up out of thin air. Another interviewee corroborated that Ngor was doing business with Singaporeans, plus Hong Kong Chinese and Malaysians. Harry doesn't have anything to do with it, but Larry is still in play, and the existence of a Singapore group remains an open lead. They apparently wanted a bank in Cambodia. That people within that group may be dangerous remains an open question. Unlike a dead end, a cul-de-sac is a roundabout. The road itself suggests you retrace your steps and find a new path. So that's exactly what we're going to do. My name is Patricia Nunan, and this is Who Killed Haing Ngor? If you knew Haing Ngor personally and would like to contribute, or if you have information or ideas that may be helpful to the investigation, please get in touch. I can be found at whokilledhaingnor@gmail.com. I'm on Telegram as MP Nunan, and I'm on Substack now as MP Nunan. That's where you'll find some multimedia explaining some details of this episode, also about the Taiwan series. If you'd like to support the investigation, there's a donation button on my webpage, whokilledhaingnor.com. Thank you for listening.